Well, thank you. Welcome into the Kingdom Mandate broadcast. I am your host this morning, Brother George Pearson, and as we open up every broadcast, we'd like to extend our gratitude and just thank you and welcome you to the broadcast. And we just ask you to continuously. We just solicit your support to continuously, help us to spread this broadcast as we begin it this morning. If you could like, share, comment. If you're on our YouTube channel, you can subscribe to our YouTube channel. If you're not yet subscribed, you can access our YouTube channel through our ministry website, georgepearsonministries.com. There's a portal there. Or you can look it up at the Kingdom Mandate broadcast. I believe that's the name of the broadcast on YouTube. And like I said, we just thank each and every one of you for continuing to support us. Continuing to support us, and as you continue to support us, we'll continue to hop on here every Monday morning at 6:30 a.m. At 6:30 a.m. This is when we air this broadcast, this program. And wow, it's already 8 months into the game. As I was tagging the broadcast on my application on StreamYard, I was putting the date in there on the title of the broadcast, and I was like, wow, it's 2026 already. It seemed like we were just in 2020 yesterday. And this year, really, we are 8 months into the year. We be 9 months in less than 20 days. In less than 20 days. So, time has really accelerated. And I think that we have to recognize if time is being accelerated, then we really have to be about our Father's business and carry out the assignment that He has called us to carry out. We don't have any time. We don't have any time to, sit on the sidelines and continue to wait or continue to be distracted about, moving and advancing in what we feel that God has, told us to do in whatever aspect of life that He's called you to. You're here for a purpose, so we have to fulfill that purpose and just begin, to do what it is that we're supposed to do, in fulfilling that purpose. And sometimes that purpose, sometimes it doesn't feel good, it doesn't look good, it doesn't sound good, but we have to realize that it is working together for our good, no matter what it is that we're experiencing, no matter what it is that we're going through. Anything that is worth having is going to be a challenge to come to fruition. It's going to be a challenge to come to fruition because of the simple fact that the enemy and the opposition does not want to see, he does not want to see how God's creation can actually rule and dominate in the earth, as his children, as born again believers. But with that being said, I was sitting here, every morning when I get on these broadcasts, I try to be prayerful and mindful of what it is that God is going to say. A lot of it is not scripted, and sometimes I don't get what I'm going to say until I sit here in front of the camera. But as I was doing what I needed to do to prepare for the broadcast, God just brought to my spirit, about a book, my book that I had, this is the first publication that I had. It's not the first book that I wrote. I think the first book that I wrote was a manual on prayer. This book right here, It's Time to Pray. But this was the second book that I published, but this was the first book that I published. This was the first one that I wrote, but this was the first one that I published. And the reason why I want to talk about this is because I think that this is the reason why a lot of us as individuals can't move forward in what it is that God has called us to do because of rejection, fear of rejection, self-rejection, and we'll get into all that. And it's nothing more than it can be nothing more than a traumatic experience that a traumatic experience that has taken place in our lives that has caused us to be at a standstill for fear of further rejection. And what it is that we have been summoned and we have been called to do. And the reason why I wrote this book, we were doing training. We were doing training in my home. We were doing training in my home, and it was a group of us, and we were doing some. I was teaching on deliverance and spiritual warfare. And as the book that I was teaching out of it, we came across the message of rejection. And as I began to teach it, I began to see, my eyes began to be open to this is some things that I had experienced, not only the things that I had experienced, but the things that a lot of people that were, a part of our group, a part of our ministry had experienced and were continuing to experience. So, I really began to hone in and do my due diligence and my research and to just, find out, what was the root cause of it, how did it, the effects of it, and, what was the remedy for it. And as I began to do that research, I began to write. I began to put pen to paper, and this is how I came up with the book. And I was sitting down. I had ministered somewhere out of town, and I was sitting down speaking to the leader's wife, me and the leader's wife. And we were just talking, and we were talking about the topic, and this is how I got the name. And, it came up that, it was an inside job, and I said, wow, that's the name. That's going to be the title of my book, The Rejection, the inside job, overcoming the hurt and the pain of rejection, because it's an inside job that takes place within us, and it has to be that's within us that causes us to experience rejection, but it also has to be an inside job that delivers us from rejection. So, when we understand this part of it, then we can understand, we can have a name with a face. This is one of my I think 10 years later, actually 12 years, like I said, going on 12 years. It'll be 12 years in January. This is still one of my number one selling books, because I think that a lot of people, when they read this book, they get a name with a face. They've experienced it, or they've seen others experience it, but they never knew what it was until it was actually, illustrated and defined for them. And then not only that, but they understood what was necessary to be done in addressing it. And this is where I really had a heart for deliverance ministry and healing ministry, because I understand that a lot of us, not just people, but a lot of us have allowed this thing to go unchecked and undiagnosed, and therefore, it might have started started in the womb of a mother, but if it goes unchecked and undiagnosed, we allow that spirit to travel with us throughout life, and it can be responsible for us not moving in what it is that we should move in, missing doors of opportunity, relationships. It's a plethora of things that that is responsible for. It can be the addiction, the drug addiction, the promiscuity. It's a number of things: insecurity, inferiority, the lust of perversion that people experience because they're looking for love, and then in exchange for the love that they can't find, they settle for the lust that is so prevalent, for them to feel the satisfaction or the belonging or the acceptance, or the acceptance for something, just because of the simple fact that what rejection is just, the absence. When a person feels the absence of love, when they feel like they've been shunned, when they slighted, overlooked, they feel as if, no one cares. They feel as if it's another thing. It's a plethora of emotional feelings, because it has been a traumatic experience. It has been a traumatic experience that has damaged the emotions, and therefore it has caused us to, put up our guards. It has caused us to push away those who have been, called to help us, those who have been called to lead us, those who have been called to help us navigate through life. But it's almost as if it's a domino effect, but when we have experienced it one time, we become very hesitant and very hesitant to allow it to be experienced again. And this is why we have to deal with the situation as it is. We have to deal with the situation as it is, and we have to come clean, and we have to begin to allow God to do the work that is needed to be done for us, to be healed internally, so that He can, so that we can fulfill what it is that we need to fulfill in life externally. So it was a few things that I want to give some definition to as we do this, as I talk about this. And I just jotted a couple of notes down as I was sitting here. As I said, as I was sitting here getting a broadcast, I just jotted down a couple of notes, and I'm gonna read out of my book as well a couple of things and hit on a couple of things, hit on a couple of things to where we can just become aware of how traumatic rejection can be, and how influential it is in the decision making, in the decisions that we make, we choose to make, and that we choose not to make. And those decisions can be very pivotal, and they can be very, influential to what it is that we do in life and we fail to do in life, because of the simple fact that we fear, once we've experienced rejection, then we have a fear of experiencing it again, because it hurts so bad. It hurt so bad. It was so damaging. It was so traumatic. It created a gaping wound that if it is not dealt with, it opens the door for a myriad of other things, to dominate our life. I can recall one time I was preparing, and I very seldom, when I prepare, I was preparing for a class that I was teaching, and I very seldom have my phone in the when I'm preparing, because I don't want to be distracted. But it was before a class that I was getting ready to minister, and I got a phone call, and I definitely, definitely don't answer unknown numbers too very often, unless I'm prompted. Unless I'm really prompted to answer it. I feel like if you got my number and I don't have your name in my number, you need to leave a message. That's just me, that's just me. And now that you have so many, spam callers and robocalls and all that, hey, you definitely, if you want to get in contact with me and you got a new number, whatever, you might want to send a text and let me know it's you, because you won't get an answer on the other end, when you make that call. But here it is. Let me get back to what I was saying. But, I was preparing, I was studying, and as I was preparing, I got a phone call, and it was a young lady. It was a young it was an older, well, yeah, I'm gonna just say it was an older lady. It was an older lady. I didn't recognize the number. It was an older lady, and she said, "Oh, can I speak to Pastor George Pearson?" And I was like, "Well, yeah, this is him speaking. How may I help you?" When she said Pastor George Pearson, I knew the nature of the call. I said, "Yeah, this is him speaking. How may I help you?" And she said, She said, "I was just here reading your book." Now, I never met the lady or anything. I was just here reading your book, and a young lady, she had met a young lady for the first time, and they were on their way to a wedding. And they were on their way to a wedding. She had gave the young lady had gave her a ride, and they were on the way to a wedding. And mind you, they had met for the first time, and as they were discussing, as they were talking and, fellowshipping on the way to the wedding, the young lady that had my book said, "Hey, I got a book you ought to read." And she gave her a copy of this book. And the lady, the older lady, she had told, she had shared how when she gave her a copy of the book, she had began to read the book. And this is what she said. She said, "Wow, this has happened to me my entire life, and now I have a name with a face. And I thank you for it. And I wanted to order some more books. I was going to reach out to so-and-so, to the young lady that gave her the book, but she said she saw my information in the book. So she thought she'd call me herself. And as she said, she thought she'd call me herself. Then she also wanted some more books because she felt like she needed to send these books to, I think it was three pastors that she knew in another state, because they needed to read the book and not only read the book, but they needed to share the information that was in the book, because she thought that it would be deemed helpful not only to them but to their congregation, and I guess to them and their congregation. So, with that being said, that was one of many testimonies. I had another testimony. I was ministering at a very influential ministry in Indianapolis. And I was ministering on prayer. I think it was somebody had got a hold to the prayer book, and they wanted me to teach the prayer book. They had got a hold to the prayer book, and they wanted me to teach. Actually, they wanted somebody else to teach it, but the person that they wanted to teach it couldn't be in town. They said, "Well, why don't you ask the guy that wrote the book to come and teach it?" And fast forwarded, as I was there, I had my other books, my other resources available. So one day I was they purchased the books, the resources. So as I was coming out of I was coming out of the grocery store, my wife and I, and my phone rang, and once again, a number I didn't know. And they asked the same thing, and I said, "Yeah, this is him speaking." And they began to tell me that they had purchased my book, this book right here on rejection. And when they began to read it, they had been married for, I think, close to 40 years. And when they began to read the book, they began to understand what their husband had been dealing with, their entire marriage. What their husband had been dealing with their entire marriage. And she wanted to know, how I could, she wanted to have some insight on how she could pray for him. So with that being said, I told her I would get back with her, and I sought the Lord, and I prayed, and I asked God to just give me some prayer points and some wisdom to share with this lady. And as I did, as the next time we had communicated, it was almost as if she was in tears, because of the simple fact that everything that God had gave me concerning the prayer points that she had needed to begin to pray for concerning her husband, Only God could have revealed that to me, because I didn't know him, I didn't know him. But the reason why I'm sharing this is because how impactful this book has been, and not only how impactful this book has been, but how eye-opening, because it has been eye-opening. People experience rejection from their parents, from their siblings, from their spouses, from their teachers, from their employers. Rejection it's a natural thing, but after we experience so much, then it becomes, it's almost as it feels like it can be a spirit that has attached itself to us. And as Job said, those things in which I have greatly feared have now come upon me. So now, since we have been rejected, we begin to fear rejection. And as we fear rejection, then, we attract it, we draw it. You get what I'm saying? We attract it and we draw it and not even know that is what's happening. And therefore, after we have drawn it for so long, now we get into a manner of self-rejecting ourselves, because we feel that it's something that's going on with us that is causing everyone else to reject us. To slide us to over, to slight, to shun, to overlook, to slight, shun, overlook, turn us down, turn us away, whatever the case may be, make us feel unloved, make us feel unwanted, whatever the case may be. We can use all those, we can use all those words, to help create an illustration of what rejection can make us feel like, or what rejection can, have us experiencing. And this is rejection is really the root cause. It can be the root cause of a lot of spiritual and mental bondage that people experience, that people are experiencing in life. And until that root cause, it's almost as if rejection is the root system of it's the root system of the hurt. It's the root system of the pain. It's the root system of the shame, the guilt, the inferiority, the security, the lust, the perversion, the pride. That's three things that when people are experiencing this, when they're experiencing this demonic entity, it's three things that they can really, allow to dominate their life. And that's fear. One of them is fear. The other one is pride. And let's go to the next one. Fear and pride. Fear, pride, and rebellion. Okay? Fear, pride, and rebellion. And when we fear something, we're afraid of it. And when we're prideful, we can be hurt. We can be hurt so much and for so long that we have the mindset and the attitude, I'll never let anybody do this to me again. And I'll never, anytime we have that never, now we become self-sufficient, because now we have to, perseverance, because we feel like we have to guard ourselves and we have to ward off anything anything that tries to identify itself with a past hurt or past pain or past experience that we went through. Okay, and as soon as we feel like it's going the way that we have previously experienced it, we immediately go into self-preservation. And that cannot always be the case. But that is generally the ideal of why this spirit wants to attack us, because it wants to get us in a place. It wants to get us in a place to where it can rule us, it can dominate us, it can cause us to make the decisions and the choices that always, that are not always acceptable, to what it is that we need to do. But with that being said, it can all, this is a powerful influence, and like I said, it's something natural, and it's something natural to, it can be natural in itself, because it can just be something that, a painful event that we experienced. We went for an interview, we didn't get the job. We went to the interview, we didn't get the job. We were in a relationship that didn't work out. It can be anything. Like I tell people, I said, it's when you experience rejection. It's not that if you experience it, it is when you experience it that determines how you deal with it, that determines the outcome. Some people can experience it and see it as a stepping stone, and others can see it and see it as a stumbling block. But even when we have the mindset and we allow the pride, even when we allow the pride to be as if, when we begin to allow pride to step in, we have the mindset, that I have to excel in this, and I have to excel in that. I have to have this, I have to have that, because this is what we begin to identify ourselves through and by, because of the simple fact that I'll show them. We have that I'll show them mindset. And when we have that I'll show them mindset, then once again, that's when we begin to allow pride to come in. That's when we begin to allow our identity to be made, our identity. That's when we allow our identity to be made in what we do, how we do it, and when we do it, by the people we associate with, the schools, the education, the cars, the homes. This is me. You get what I'm saying? That's the act of pride, because of what it was through rejection that we have experienced. Hey, good morning, Brother Harry, that we have experienced with rejection. And I see Brother Harry, he just joined in. He was one of the, he was one of those that were in, when we was writing this book, he was one of those that was in the class. He was one of those that was a part of the group when we began to write when we began to put pen to the paper. And, like I said, 10 years ago, and now he's still hopping on. He's still hopping on to this day, because I do believe that the things that were, that came forth out of this book was life changing and transforming, and then we get rejection. You mean not rejection, but we get the spirit of rebellion. Then we get the spirit of rebellion. When we look at it, we look at fear. We dealt with fear. We dealt with fear. We dealt with pride, and then we get rebellion. That rebellious attitude will always, it will always, once you experience rejection, it can push you into a place of rebellion, to where you come against authority, where you come against, anything, once again, anything that you may feel is attached to something that have made you feel the way that you feel and experience the emotions that you're experiencing. I want to read something out of here. Out of my book. It's in chapter 2 on page 7. And I want to read this. It says, an emotionally damaged spirit that is rooted in rejection can have influence in various areas of an individual's life. This spirit of rejection has dominating offspring that it works hand in hand with. And those are fear, pride, and rebellion. Fear, which is a passive in nature, and pride and rebellion, which are aggressive in nature. When rejection is encountered, one can react in one way or another, in fear or pride, or they can also lash out in rebellion. Fear. to be afraid of something or someone as likely to be dangerous, painful, and threatening. Pride, to think more highly of oneself than one should. Exaggerated self-esteem, conceit, haughtiness, and arrogance. Rebellion, the resistance to or defiance of any authority or opposing force. When one reacts in fear, it causes them to become passive and submit to and accept the opinions of others that others have towards them. So if a person says that they can accomplish a certain goal or objective in life, they lack the encouragement and support needed to inspire them to achieve it. The person backs away from pursuing those goals, objectives, for fear of failure, embarrassment, and the fear of suffering further rejection. Fear can keep a person from giving or receiving love and cause them to become withdrawn and isolated from a world that those that are in it. Fear will also cause the person to live a life of fantasy, imagining that they were someone else or somewhere else in order to escape the reality that is before them. So when we look at that definition of, when we look at that definition of fear, fear, once again, when it says that, when we fear what other people say, when we fear what other people think, when we have to place what we think and what we believe and what we feel that we can achieve in the hands or in the minds of someone else, and whatever they say we can do or we can't do, we buy into it, then we sell ourselves short from going forth in what God has told us that we can do. This is why the identity of the believer has to be known, because once you know who you are, you can know, once you know whose you are, then you can know who you are. And what I'm saying is, once you know that you're a child of God, then you can know who you are, because you're his offspring, And what the enemy wants to do with rejection, what he wants to do with rejection is to bring so much hurt and to damage your life, and with so much hurt and so much pain, emotionally and mentally and physically, that it mars the image of that in which God has created you in. Okay, so now we fear the acceptance, not being accepted. Therefore, we don't want to do, we don't want to go against what it is that people say that we can or we can't do. Okay, it's because we feel like we have to be accepted. So because we don't want to experience the rejection. And sometimes, sometimes I can recall in the scripture, in the scripture, it talked about the children of Israel, how they saw themselves. And I talk about it in this book. They saw themselves as grasshoppers. They saw themselves as weak. They saw themselves as insufficient. They saw that the way that they saw themselves, they saw themselves was not in agreement with the way that God saw them. And the way they saw themselves kept them from going in and possessing the land of promise that God had given them. And a lot of times, fear of rejection will keep us from moving in, say for instance, the job opportunity. You have the job opportunity, but you're so afraid that you've been turned down, the last 6 times, that you don't even want to go the 7th time, or you've been turned down the last 3 times, you don't want to go. And that's nothing more than what? The fear of rejection. You get what I'm saying? Sometimes you can be rejected so many times, so much in life that you just want to quit. You just want to throw in the towel. You don't even want anything to do with it anymore. You get what I'm saying? I give up. I quit. You get what I'm saying? And one thing in life, we can't, quitting is not an option. We have to have the mindset of a winner. We have to have the mindset of an achiever. We have to have the mindset of someone that's going to have the influence to impact, impact the lives for the better with the decisions that we make. Not only our lives, because our lives would just be the offshoot of affecting and influencing and impacting the lives of others. And we have to have that mindset that, the decisions that I make, the decisions that you make, whether they be good or whether they be bad, are going to affect someone else. Okay, I tell my granddaughter all the time, you're a leader, and to make sure that and to make sure you lead in a correct way, because what people see you do, they're going to do, because that is the anointing, that is the grace, that is the favor that is upon your life. And once so therefore you can lead people down the right road. You can lead people down the right road, or you can lead people down the wrong road, but you have to make the decision to lead people down the right way. You get what I'm saying? Because people look at you, whether you believe it or not. People are looking at you and they're determining what they're going to do based upon what you are doing or what you have done, okay? Because you have influence, whether you believe it or not. Whether you believe it or not, someone is looking at you. Someone is off in the balance looking at you, and they're paying attention to everything you do, everything you say. To be very careful, I have to be very careful. Like the idea, some of the things that I see, some of the things that I hear, some of the things I see, some of the things I hear, I don't even expound on it, because I know that there are some things that others don't need to know, because they don't, they're not there yet, and I don't want to be one. I don't want to be one that causes someone to stumble and fall because of how I felt about something, okay? There's some things that, I put it like this, there's some things that some people need to get on their own, because I'm not going to bring it to them. Because I'm not going to bring it to them, because it might not be, it might not be wisdom to share that, and and I'm gonna just throw that out there like that. But anyway, going back to, being afraid, you can't be afraid, and you can't be fearful. You can't be people pleasing. You can't fear, not being accepted. You know what I'm saying? Sometimes being rejected is healthy, because if you got into those groups, those circles, if you got into those rooms, they could have, they really could have killed, what I'm saying, what was in you, more so than bringing what was in you to life. You get what I'm saying? Because if you would have got into certain circles, if you would have had some doors God shut, because he said, no, you don't need to go in that door, because I know the end result. Okay, you don't need to connect with them, because I know the end result. Now you thinking that they don't want to be a part, or they don't want to be bothered with you, but it's not that they don't want to be bothered with you, is that God don't want you to be bothered with them. So therefore he's placed that barrier, he's placed something there that will not allow that connection to take place, because he knows what it will, what it will entail. Okay, so there's some healthy rejection, and some things, it's some people in some places that I look back, they always say hindsight is 20/20, and I say, God, I thank you. I didn't understand it then, but I understand it now. I'm glad I did not go there. I'm glad I did not make that connection. I'm glad I did not keep bamming on that, knocking on that door and feeling like, they didn't want to be bought. No, that was God that hardened the heart. That was God that, what I'm saying, that put the veil so that they couldn't see, because he wanted to keep you in obscurity. He wanted to keep you hidden. He wanted to keep you, he wanted to keep you away and protect you from, what he saw could really be detrimental to what it was, to your development, to your spiritual, your emotional development, okay, to advance his kingdom. So we have to be very mindful of things of that nature, and we can't allow things of that nature. We can't allow things of that nature to do what? To cause us to fall into a place to where we allow the rejection to really rule and dominate our lives. Rejection is a part of life. I can remember I was talking to I was talking to as a matter of fact, he was my cousin, but the rest of his soul, he's passed on and went to glory now. But when he picked up the book and he started reading it, he said, "Nah, man, I got to put this book down because it's opening up Pandora's box." And it was some things that he didn't want to deal with, but at the same time, it was some things that he had to deal with, and he saw it, and he ended up picking it back up, but it wasn't something that he just wanted to, initially, deal with because it was hurtful, it was painful. And it's just like, having a stab wound or a knife wound that is so many millimeters from a intricate artery, they can't just snatch that knife out. They have to surgically remove that, because if they don't surgically remove it with precision and preciseness, that it can actually cut and kill. It can damage the artery or eye or whatever, and cause more harm than good, because they didn't do it they didn't do it in the correct way. And this is what we have to deal with. We have to be so we have to be so delicate. We have to be so delicate. We have to be delicate with some things that we deal with. We have to be very mindful. We have to use wisdom and tact, because some people, we had another, well, I don't, like I said, as I think about it, this book has, we had a young lady, the experience that took place, the rejection and the abandonment and the hurt and the pain, it all began to come to the surface, and it all began to manifest. And she didn't come just for prayer. Well, she came to talk, get some stuff off her chest. But then when I started to pray for her, then all that stuff just started, it just started, what I'm saying, breaking off of her. And I say that to say that you can actually see the countenance of her face just change. But what I'm saying is this, there's a time and there's a place for everything. Some people want to deal with it because they understand that if they don't deal with it, they can't go forward. Some people don't want to deal with it because of the simple fact that they're not ready, because fear has gripped them of what is the unknown. You get what I'm saying? What is the unknown? Fear of the unknown. How will I react? How will I respond? And I talk about that in this book as well. I think it was a book years ago that I read. I think it was Pigs in a Parlor, and it was Frank and Ida Mae Hammond, Ida Hammond. But anyway, they were praying for a young lady, and they were praying for a young lady, and counseling her and praying for her and helping her, trying to get through the challenges and the trauma that she had experienced. But God had showed her that it was a grouping. It was so much that was intertwined that if they did it all at once, they couldn't do it all at once, because if they did, then the lady would lose the identity of who she was, because all those things were a part of her life. And I'm saying that to say this: there's a lot of things that we have allowed to become a part of our lives, and we don't, we have just accepted it. to where we no longer really have to accept it. And this is why this is why the church really, in advancing the kingdom, we have to begin to pull down the kingdom of darkness, and we know the kingdom of God is within, so therefore the kingdom of darkness is there. That's where rulership is as well. So we have to begin to understand that there's some things that has to be torn down. There's some things that has to be pulled down, some strongholds that has to be torn down, some structures that has to be dismantled, some root systems that have to be torn up, before we can really begin to rebuild our lives. But with that being said, I want to thank each and every one of you guys for tuning in. I pray that this was something, that, that was, that you were able to get something out of, that, as I said, when I sat here this morning preparing my broadcast, God had placed that in my heart, and I jotted down a few notes, and I jotted down a couple of notes and things of that nature, and I said, well, all right, Lord, this is what you want me to talk about. We'll talk about this today. And so therefore, I'm pretty sure that it was somebody that needed to hear it. I needed to hear it. You needed to hear it. I was telling somebody the other day, I said, a lot of times, what I do is, on the broadcast is very spontaneous. That's why I say a prophetic voice for a new generation, and, being a prophetic voice, a lot of things are spontaneous. And like I said, a lot of my teachings are very systematic. A lot of my writings are very systematic. They're scripture filled, everything, when it comes to the books. But when I'm on this broadcast, I do believe that God is just, he's using me as that prophetic voice, very spontaneous, just moving and flowing with the Spirit, and allowing the people to hear what it is that he has to say, not what George has to say, but what he has to say. So I pray that this was a blessing to someone. I pray that even if you revisit it on the, revisit it on the replay, or you hear it on the YouTube at a later date, hey, I do believe that it was intended for you to hear it. And it, I might go a little bit more in depth in this next week. I might go a little bit more in depth in this next week, because this book right here, Let It Go, The Power of Forgiveness, that's a remedy of that rejection, of that hurt, of that pain. We have to come to a place to where we allow things to, the resentment, the bitterness, the rage, the anger, that is all associated with that as well. As we was talking about, the pride, the fear, the pride, the rebellion, the insecurity, the lust, the perversion, all those things are resolved, and has its root in rejection. Because once you've rejected, the person hurt you, you become bitter, resentful, unforgiving. Now you move in anger, you moving in rage, and then, if you're not careful, this is where a spirit of murder can come in. You get what I'm saying? It's once again, when you see how these things operate, you can see why people do what they do, and that's the biggest thing, bringing enlightenment, bringing insight, bringing understanding. That's why I never judge people when I talk about it. I talk about it in the book. I never look at because it's a reason why people do what they do. You get what I'm saying? They not just out here being willy-nilly and doing what they do because they like it. It's a reason behind what they do. You know what I'm saying? And when we understand that reason, now we can have more mercy and more compassion and be more prayerful concerning them, concerning them and standing in the gap and interceding for them, that thing be broken off of them. But with that being said, I think I will revisit this in a little bit more, extensive view. Matter of fact, I think this is the other book. Yeah, let me get off here. My other book was a result. This book, matter of fact, this was one of my class. This book right here was created out of one of the classes, Healing and Deliverance Made Easy. You can see a couple of those videos on the YouTube page, Healing and Deliverance Made Easy, and Restoring Hope, because it's called Restoring Hope. Everybody needs hope restored in some way, shape, or form, in some fashion. They've lost hope. They've lost hope for a mother, a father, a sister, a brother, a son, a daughter. You get what I'm saying? But when you understand that Jesus came, to set the captives free, he came to heal the brokenhearted. He came, to preach deliverance and healing, emotional healing. When we understand that was to release us from our oppressor, then hope can be restored. Like I say, it's more than just going to church and hearing a song and hearing a sermon. When people are contending with things, that they have they're contending with things in which they have no desire to continue to deal with, but they need a way out. And I think that God has given us a way out in his word, and God has given us a way out as leaders to help lead them out, even as Moses led the children of Israel out of the oppressive nature of Pharaoh. God wants his leaders to lead, he wants his leaders to lead the people out of the oppressive nature of not only Pharaoh's regime, which is nothing more than a type and shadow of darkness, and wants them to enter into the promised land. When they came out of Egypt and they went into the promised land, they came out of darkness, but they still couldn't get into the promised land because they did not deal with, the hurt and the pain and the mindset that was shaped, fashioned, and formed by the traumatic experiences that they had while they were in Egypt. But with that being said, let me get up off here, because I'll be going on and on and on and on, and I got to get my day ready. Got a couple of things I got to do before I lay it down to get ready to go to work. Okay, so with that being said, I want to thank each and every one of you guys for tuning in, and I'll see you next time around. God bless. Peace. Bye-bye.